here. Thank you for being here and thank you for listening. This will be episode 18 of the Zen Cop podcast. I apologize for my hiatus. I had a pretty busy couple of weeks at work and just a lot going on. And like I've said many times before, I will always try to put out content when time permits. But ultimately, if it comes down to needing a break, I will take whatever I can get. And I would encourage all of you to do the same. Over the last few months, I've been getting a lot of questions, not necessarily on social media, but in person. And the question, they've kind of been catching me off guard because it's the first time I've heard this question in many years. And that question is, what's the process to become a cop? And before 2020, I'd heard that question quite frequently, whether it was at a gas station or some random person on a call, or it was a referral from a family member or friend. And if you're a cop and you're listening, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Your mom's neighbor's son or your wife's coworker's nephew, they're interested in becoming a cop. And there was always someone interested, so much so that, you were always that point of contact or referral for that person. And when I was younger, I was put in contact with a friend of my dad's who was a deputy for a local sheriff's office, and we started emailing back and forth, and he sort of gave me the entire process broken down and what to expect and all that stuff. And it was helpful. And it kind of gave me like a roadmap of the entire process. And over the years as a cop, you would regularly get the same generic referral from someone and sort of guide that person through the hiring process. And they figured out rather quickly if they actually wanted to do this or not. And of course they would ask you, do you love your job? And that question, especially now, is very subjective, especially when it comes to climate and morale. But most of the time, you would say, "Yes, I love my job, best job I ever had." And if you knew the person well enough, and you knew that they had what it took to be a cop, then you would push them to pursue it. And if they weren't going to be the right person for the job, you would encourage them to, do what they wanted, but maybe just reinforce that this is probably going to be a lot harder than they thought. But after 2020 specifically, there were a lot of cops who would genuinely respond to that question with, why the hell would you ever want to be a cop? Why now? And completely discourage that individual from entering this career field because you knew it was just so terrible. But as time goes on, we start to forget, society especially, that as cops we rarely forget, and if anything we hold on to things probably for too long and with the wrong intentions. But at the same time, it's the experiences, especially the horrible ones, that really allow us to remember the past, which is something that is important if remembered and valued for the right reasons. But society, they've kind of moved forward, they've moved on. And of course, with those challenges comes strength and resilience, depending on the circumstances. But specifically for 2020, the entire ordeal, to include the total lack of support pretty much anywhere from the majority of the general public and the local government, state government leadership overall, will probably leave the knife in our backs for a long time. Now, that's not a quick thing to move forward with in terms of getting back to normal. But that's kind of the messed up part about cop world. It really doesn't matter how we feel, good, bad, or indifferent. Nothing ever stops moving. And no matter how badly we need or want it to, it's the simple fact that the world will keep turning and evil is going to keep existing no matter what we have going on internally or on a personal or even departmental level. But with society moving forward a lot faster than law enforcement, I think there's a younger generation who is seeing that the dust has cleared and there's a lot more positives to being a cop than there are negatives right now. Or it's hopefully a new generation that understands that there will always be some type of chaos mixed in with the major catastrophic events that will, at some point change the world. And then, time coupled with retirements, movements, the next thing you know, that generation is either promoted, retired, or they're gone. And the only people who will be keeping any part of that history alive are going to be the ones who lived it themselves. And I've been a student of history my whole life, and more so as an adult, I've really sort of taken really deep dives on certain portions of history, and we can learn so much about society just by going back 100 years, sometimes less, sometimes more. But ultimately, history proves that society is repetitious in nature and sometimes in the most destructive of ways. And only the old guys of the group will be able to tell you that is true because they've seen it happen in real time. And I'm old enough now to tell any new cop that the tidal waves that we will face throughout our careers will be based on, sometimes even the most mundane of incidents that ultimately become major critical incidents. And more importantly, that as cops, we don't get to choose the moment will choose us. And as I grow older and slowly become part of the senior guys at my agency, I think there is much of a benefit to being honest with the new generation. And rather than answering questions with, sort of just canned language, perhaps we should tell them exactly how we feel, or more importantly, how we felt. Over the last few years, I've seen myself becoming a lot more direct with the newer guys, not being a dick in terms of directness, but actually explaining things and taking the extra time to ensure that they understand them. In cop world, we have a tendency to just sort of, you know, rattle off these sentences that we understand because we've done it for so many years, but maybe it would be worth the extra time and energy to explain it further. And this topic can be applied to just about anything from tactics to talking about the reality of the job. And perhaps there needs to be more of an emphasis to the things that we wished that we should have done, or things that we could have done along the way to make us better cops today. And sadly, so much of that emphasis goes into this, sort of tactical mindset. And don't get me wrong, the tactics absolutely has a place at the table and should be at the head of the table. But we can talk about, range, defensive tactics, less lethal. We can even introduce stuff like case law and all the inner workings of court testimony, good report writing, and essentially checking all of the, good boxes for being a good cop. But some of the major boxes that don't get checked, or more importantly, some of the boxes that don't even exist or are identified, are the ones that are going to keep you alive longer. And they have nothing to do with equipment at all. Understanding that your well-being, both mentally and physically, is going to allow you to be a better version of yourself, which at the end of the day is what essentially makes what kind of cop you're going to be for that day. The simple fact that gets ignored most of the time is that if you are not doing well as a person, you're not going to be doing well as a cop. In fact, you're going to be a horrible cop, and eventually something bad will happen to you or someone else. And I'm not going to say that you're not going to have bad days, because you are, lots of them actually. But eventually, if you don't start to address some of those bad days properly and with the right tools, before you know it, you are going to be the worst possible version of yourself. And in that scenario, you may not have the option to change. And over the years, however, I have seen a lot more emphasis on mental health, which is good. And I've seen a lot more of that getting brought up at the academy, and with a healthy introduction to the realities of this job. I think sometimes there's a pretty substantial learning curve, and I think most agencies operate on a reactive basis when it comes to identifying certain issues, especially if it's not a very common issue. But I assure you, after that happens, there will be a new policy, a new procedure, and essentially a new way of doing business, because something bad did happen. And in my opinion, that's a very dangerous way to sort of move forward. And there should be a proactive approach to not everything, but certain things that we know are going to come up no matter what we do. I've said this many times before, and I'll say it forever. It does not matter, excuse me, it's not a matter of if, but when something will happen. And if more cops understood a lot of the pitfalls that exist, and more importantly, how to avoid them, we would probably see a lot more success and improved morale, even in very challenging scenarios and time periods. And hopefully, in time, the older cops start to understand that if they were honest, and not honest in the sense of just complaining about how horrible things were or how horrible things are, maybe they actually give some insight into the, sort of the concept of, learning from my mistakes type conversation, or, here's my advice for this. When I was younger, I really wish someone really hammered, something like how much this job will affect your home and family life. And I knew that was a factor, and I knew that that was going to be hard, but maybe if somebody actually set me down and told me about the details that they experienced, and not just a broad brush of, hey, your home life's going to suck sometimes. I already know that. When my boys were younger, they would always tell me that they wanted to be cops when they grew up. And I sort of cringed at that thought. And that was before 2020. Now I want to steer them so far away from this career field that's not even funny. But ultimately, I want my boys to do whatever they want to do. But I hope that with that, they saw as kids that they understood that this job really does affect home life and raising your children. And someday when my boys are old enough, I'm going to sit them down and explain exactly why certain things happened the way they did. And I can give them the details. I can walk them through that part of my life that I tried to shield them from for so many years. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about that every day. And that thought is just pure hope that they will understand the reasoning behind all of it, and that they would understand that they had to share me with some of the worst parts of society. And in doing so, I also got to help a lot of people, to include kids that were their age and were not as lucky as they were. And that thought haunts my mind constantly. And my wife always tells me how good of a father I am. But deep down, especially with how fast time flies by, I really don't think it was worth it in the end. But if you compared that to the victim, I can't put a price on any of that stuff, right? I can't put a price on what that meant for the person that I helped. And if you asked the victim if it was worth it, it wouldn't even be a question. Their life changed forever, and in a way that they never thought possible. And the cost on my end was missing my kid's birthday. It's this very odd and depressing game of checks and balances, but nothing is free, especially when you are dealing with the scum of society. So it's this strange no man's land where my brain spends most of its time in between home and work. And I do have a fairly long commute. So it's kind of this odd purgatory between, heaven and hell, where I have this, 45 minutes to collect my thoughts and do my very best to be in a good mood, even when I'm not. And out of all the horrible things we deal with, I think that internal strife is probably one of the most realistic and most difficult things to navigate when it comes to this career field. And I think that if more senior cops took the time, and more importantly, the effort to verbalize some of that stuff to the new generation, maybe it would have some type of impact for them down the road. And with these new inquiries we're getting, and the new generation considering this career field, I would tell them something that may actually sound, completely contradictory to everything I just talked about, but it's true. If you really want to be a cop, and despite all of the fucked up shit that you see on the news, on the street, and all the horrible things that you've seen over the past few years, and you still want to do it, then do it. This job is not a career. It is a calling. And if you think you can do it, by all means, don't let the rest of us stop you just because we're a little pissed off and we're a little tired right now. You guys are going to be the next generation that's going to have to police a very odd portion of time that is going to require a lot of work. With that being said, make sure you're taking the time that you need to be the best version of yourself. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you are a Spotify or Apple listener, please drop a rating below. Be the best version of yourself, and you will rarely find any room for negativity. Thanks again, guys, and enjoy your Thanksgiving, and we'll be back here next week. Be safe.